One of the jobs I had was assembling particle detectors at a science and tech center that supported nuclear physics research. If you've ever heard of a quark, these particle detectors that I worked on were some of the tools that were used to discover evidence of the very first quark. If you ever look in an encyclopedia, you may see a round disk, an X-ray picture of a round disk with sparks going across it. And that would have been the end of one of these, the end plate of one of these particle detectors. Basically, it was a big vacuum tube. Some of them were about this big around, some of them were as big around as the room, with a big disk as an end plate and all these little feed-throughs, gold-plated feed-throughs that held wires a tenth the size of a human hair. And these wires would go through this tube, which was filled with an inert gas. And the idea was that as a particle passed by a wire, the wire has a force field around it, an electromagnetic field around it from the current flowing through it, and it could measure how fast the particle was going by how many of these wires it passed by at what speed. These wires would go back to a computer and report back, and so they could analyze it. So one of my jobs, aside from machining all these little feed-throughs, was to box up the particle detector once we were done. So this big thing would go into a crate. And I put it together, shipped it off to a lab in the US where they were going to do some testing with it, and it came back to Canada where I was with a note on it saying that they couldn't get into it. They didn't know what kind of screwdriver to use. The fasteners were different than they were familiar with. I'd used Robertson wood screws, and a Robertson wood screw has a square head on it. Phillips was the popular one that you would use in the United States. In Canada, we use Robertson. And my question is, why is Phillips the de facto standard in the US? How did that happen? And if you think back to the turn of the century, the biggest assembly line at the time was Ford with its Model A automobiles. And so the story goes, Ford went to tender for fasteners for the Model A automobile. And he invited Mr. Phillips and Mr. Robertson to bid on the contract. His stipulation was that he wanted to keep the crates that the fasteners came in so he could use them as floorboards. That's why they're called floorboards. The floor of the car used to be made of wooden boards. Robertson said no, he wanted the crates back so he could refill them and ship them, and Phillips said keep the crates, he got the contract. So that's how a de facto standard was born. And presumably if you were building toasters at that time, you would probably buy the fasteners that were most readily available, and if you're supplying tools or if you're a mechanic, you'd probably have a Phillips screwdriver. So everyone's using it because everyone else is using it, and it became a de facto standard. I assume that Robertson came back to Canada and got a government contract, and that's why we end up using Robertson screws here. It's a superior technology, though. If you've ever tried to loosen a stuck screw, one that's rusted or what have you, a Phillips screw tends to strip the head, whereas a Robertson, it's a nice secure head, and it'll pull out much more easily. Now, in modern days, we've got Quirks screws, and different technologies have come along, but it took a long time to improve on the Robertson screw. But it didn't get the wide adoption that Phillips did because everyone's using it, because everyone else is using it. There's many examples of this, Beta versus VHS, IBM PC versus Macintosh. You can look at even operating systems, Microsoft Windows versus anything else. Everyone's using it, not because it's the superior technology, but because everyone else is using it.